This presentation tonight was the result of Audrey Colbeck from the Spencer branch of the Marathon County Library System. So this was Audrey's brainchild, and so I want to introduce her. Come on, Audrey. And we are so happy that she came to the TAC Center and asked us to host the event. So, Audrey, thank you.
You are welcome. Wow. The fact that I am standing here tonight in front of all of you is just unreal to me. And I thank you all for coming. And I'd like to send out a huge thank you to Mike Andrews. I don't know if he's in here, but he's the superintendent of school, and he was so helpful in getting the TAC Center. So I want to send out a huge thank you to Mike, wherever he is. Two questions I had gotten over and over was why and how this program came to be. I'll do the why first. We have my husband to thank for that. About 4 years ago, I had a program called Wisconsin Remembers, which honored our Vietnam vets. This traveling wall came from a museum in Madison, and I was the first to showcase it. In 5 days, I had nearly 400 people from around the state come to visit that wall. On the final night, my husband said to me, "You know, you're never going to do a program bigger than that." Yeah, I took that as a dare. I had to raise my bar. So right now I want to thank you, Ray, for the underhanded dare. And if tonight, when we get home, you say, "You'll never do a program bigger than that," I'm just going to nod and agree. How? I wanted a subject where there were no divided lines, where it didn't matter if you were Democrat or if you were Republican. A subject where we were all united. 9/11. A day where there was a communal sorrow, where we were all in horror as the planes hit the first tower, the second tower, the Pentagon, and the Flight 93, where the flight attendants and the passengers tried to take over the terrorists, but crashed in Pennsylvania. We couldn't stop watching the TV, no matter how awful it was. We were transfixed. We couldn't stop watching. And it's a day that we can all remember where we were, what we were doing, and now children are reading about it in history books. I started doing my research, and I got the number for a Mr. Chris Tucker, an air traffic controller on 9/11. I gave Chris a call, and after we spoke, he graciously agreed to come to Spencer and speak. We had a date all set, and then COVID entered our lives. Chris and I kept in contact. We had hopes that one day there would be this program. We spoke often, we texted, we emailed, and I even got to go visit him in Long Island with my daughter and a friend. Again, more planning, more calls, and finally, a new date was set. Monday, August 29th. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Chris Tucker. Chris, let's roll.
Is this one on? Yes, it is. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you very much. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you for being here. I can spell the word county. I swear. But I was in a hurry today. So, I gotta keep this thing from going to sleep on you. So, I am an air traffic controller. Well, I'm retired now. I retired in 2014. I'm an air traffic controller. I worked at a facility called New York Center, or New York ARTCC, Air Route Traffic Control Center. There are two basic types of air traffic control. There's terminal and route. Terminal is divided into two things, the one that you're all familiar with, the control tower. Associated with airports also is something called an approach control, which is a radar facility that guides aircraft to and from busier airports in congested airspace. This is a map of some of the approach control airspace around New York. The stuff that's outlined in a light pink here is the New York TRACON, Terminal Radar Approach Control, which is a combined approach control facility that controls the traffic into and out of Newark, LaGuardia, and Kennedy, and all of their satellite airports. So smaller airports like Westchester County, Long Island's Islip Airport, and all the airports. Newark has a ton of satellites, Teterboro, there's just a ton of them out there. So that's the New York Air Route Traffic Control Airspace, and this is the Catskill area around Stewart, up in the Hudson River Valley. This is Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in purple. This is Elmira, New York, the light green. This is Binghamton, New York, approach control. This little tiny yellow one is Reading, Pennsylvania. It gets its own approach control because of a senator that had a bug up his... Honestly. This is McGuire Air Force Base. Atlantic City is down here. This is Philadelphia's airspace here. And this is Harrisburg, Pennsylvania's airspace. So these are lower altitudes. Typically the highest altitude that an approach control will own is 10,000 feet. Philly owns up to 12, New York owns up to 17. And then apart from the terminal environment, which is the towers and these approach controls, there's a thing called the en route environment, and there are facilities called air route traffic control centers that control all of the airspace above and around these, and we own down to the ground in places where there are no approach controls. So this is a map of some of the centers in the country. There are 21 of them. There's one in Hawaii, there's one in Anchorage. You can see that the airspace around New York is very small, and that's a direct result of the effects of the strike in 1981 when Reagan fired a bunch of controllers. They also took airspace away from New York because that is where the strike fomented, and they didn't want it happening again. And it has had tremendous repercussions that are still in effect today. Delays into and out of New York are frequently a direct result of the fact that New York doesn't own the airspace around its own airports. And New York Center also is responsible for a large portion of the Atlantic Ocean, including the approach to and from Bermuda. That was one of the gifts that Great Britain gave us prior to World War II, when we started shipping arms and goodies to them before we actually entered the war, and the British gave us the airspace around Bermuda. So this is Boston Center, this is Cleveland Center. It's called ZOB because it's in Oberlin, Ohio. Chicago Center is, so you can see Wisconsin has two centers on top of it, Minneapolis Center and Chicago Center. It's AU because Chicago Center is in Aurora, Illinois. Boston Center is in Nashua, New Hampshire. Go figure. So anyway, you can see that the airspace, the domestic radar airspace around New York is in New York Center is kind of small compared to the rest of the country. In fact, Salt Lake Center has single sectors that are larger than the entirety of New York's domestic radar airspace. That's the building I worked in for 25 years. I retired in 2014. It's a large room inside this portion of the building, there's a large room. I like to say it's about the size of a football field, but it's not quite. Filled with radar scopes that look exactly like that. That's the system we use. So the radar controller sometimes has an assistant sitting with him called a handoff controller or a D position. We have all kinds of buttons down here that we can use to communicate directly with other controllers. One of the things that's not obvious to laymen is that controllers don't just talk to airplanes. When we're working on radar, a lot of the time we spend communicating with other controllers. And the reason we do that is because the airspace that we control, when you're sitting at a sector and you're operating as a controller, that airspace belongs to you. It is completely yours, and no one's allowed in it without your permission. It has to be that way. You can only have one person in charge of a piece of airspace, otherwise things can get very, very complicated very, very quickly. This is, well, let me back up real quick. I'll show you just a cute little piece from an NBC special with Tom Brokaw. And no volume whatsoever, which is okay. That's me, working at the East Texas sector right there. There's Tom. Oh, it didn't show? I'm sorry, hang on, let me bring it over to the big screen. Thank you. So I'm actually sitting at, this is the East Texas sector. It has nothing to do with Texas. It's in airspace over in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. A high altitude sector. This is the sector that United 175 was in when it was hijacked. The controller sitting there was a friend of mine who's no longer with us. But he died with 14 friends around him at a Yankees game. Okay. I need a mouse. I don't like these little pads. Okay, now it's working. All right, so in blue you have some of the New York Center sectors. In green, some of the Washington Center sectors. Washington continues down here. I'm just depicted some of the sectors that touch New York, and then some of the sectors in Boston Center that touch New York. And in several places you can see they overlap because there are sectors that slide underneath other sectors. These two green sectors, this is a Newark arrival sector, this is a LaGuardia arrival sector, and they slide underneath the southern edge of New York's airspace here at 13,000 feet and below. So the point of this slide is just to demonstrate to you that the airspace can get extraordinarily complex. And when you're a controller and you own a sector, you have to know the airspace completely and thoroughly because it belongs to you and no one else. And so if you're going to climb an aircraft to an altitude, you have to make sure that that altitude is your altitude and it doesn't belong to one of these other sectors. This is a kind of a cool depiction from Google Earth showing some New York Center airspace. So these are the tall ones, are high altitude sectors, and underneath them there are very tiny, what look very tiny but aren't, lower altitude sectors. So these are all New York sectors, and then these are the New York sectors. These are, out here on the right side, are radar sectors prior to the oceanic airspace that's non-radar. And that's from straight up above looking down. So New York City is right here. We're going to talk about this piece of airspace here. This is the East Texas sector, or Sector 42. This is the Kennedy High sector, Sector 56. And below the East Texas sector, so you can see, again, you can see East Texas here. It has a very distinctive shape. Northern half of New Jersey, eastern Pennsylvania. This is Allentown, Pennsylvania, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is down here. New York City is right there. So if I flip back and forth between these two, this is the high altitude sector and the low. So on 9/11, I was sitting at this sector right here. This is the Yardley sector, or sector 55. And the basic flow in that sector is it's west and southwestbound. Metro area departures from New York City depart southwestbound over 2 airways that travel to the southwest from here and here. And departures from Kennedy come out with their own separate departure fix, and they go westbound, and then they turn left if necessary. So we have 2 crossing feeds there. That's what the sector looks like. 3 basic airways inside the sector. J48. This is the road to Atlanta, Raleigh, Durham, Roanoke, and this is J75, which is the road to Greensboro, Columbia, and the west coast of Florida. So here's the departures out of Kennedy come out, and they hit this airway called J230. So this goes west, joins an airway that goes to California, or you can turn left on J75 and go to Florida, or left on J48 and go to Atlanta or Houston, for example. You can see Newark, Kennedy, LaGuardia is right there, although I don't have it drawn on the scope. So these are locations that have names. We call them fixes or waypoints. They're navigational waypoints that pilots use to navigate by. And controllers will issue instructions to pilots. So for example, if I have an aircraft who's southwestbound on J75, and I turn him off course, now he's, say for example, he's out here and he's no longer navigating on the airway, and I want to put him back on course. I can do several things. The easiest thing to do is to say, clear direct to the Copes intersection, resume your own navigation. And he'll make a right turn, he'll go to Copes, and then he'll join J75. I can also give him a heading to intercept the airway. Turn right heading 275, join J75, resume your own navigation. And that's what the sector looks like. So this sector has more shelves of airspace that are not depicted. This is a slice of what the sector looks like at 28,000 feet. It owns down to 14,000 feet in the middle, down to 18,000 feet over here. I only own up to 22 here, so 18 to 22 in this little box. It just gets a little complicated, but you don't have to know all that stuff. I just wanted you to know that it's there. This is what it looks like when you're talking to airplanes. I just have a picture of the sector outlined so you can see it. Not the same airplanes, but it doesn't matter. So this is what we call a data block, which consists of a bunch of data. On the top you have the call sign of the aircraft. This is Delta 1426. On the next line you have 3 pieces of altitude information. You have an assigned altitude on the left, the aircraft's reported altitude that's coming straight from the airplane to us and being reported on the scope. That's referred to as mode C altitude. And then a little indicator that tells me either he's climbing or he's descending or he's in level flight, and we can put other indicators here that tell us other pieces. There's a lot of information that this data block is capable of displaying. I just kind of tried to limit it here to the important stuff. The most important stuff is the altitude, the ground speed, which is this 376, and the target. There are 9 different possible representations that the system can use to draw a target on the scope. We're only going to talk about 3 of them. Most people are familiar with that. They know what that is when they see it, but they don't necessarily know what that is. Radar, in the way it's used in commercial aviation and the military, consists of 2 basic forms. The big antenna is what you're familiar with, where you shoot a signal of radiation out, it bounces off of something, and then the antenna captures it. And the antenna is rotating, and it can time the amount of time it takes from the signal that got sent to when it gets received. And it can tell how far away an object is. That's called primary radar. That's what we call it. Secondary radar is this little gizmo up top, this bar. That's called an interrogator. So airplanes have a device on board called a transponder, and when they file a flight plan and they get clearance to depart an airport, the controller will assign a 4-digit beacon code to them in octal format, which means it's in base 7, which means there are no 8s and there are no 9s. So it's 0 through 7. So you get a 4-digit beacon code, and that way, when the target appears for you on the radar, the system knows who you are, and it attaches that code to your flight plan. And that's why, when your target appears on the scope, it appears in this format, the left-leaning slash, and there's a call sign attached to that target. That's what an en route antenna looks like. This one is North Truro on Cape Cod. They're very big, as you can see. Those are air route surveillance radars. They're much larger than the ones you see at airports, which are airport surveillance radars. So, 2 different types of targets that we're going to see tonight. We're going to see 3, but right now I'm only going to talk about these 2. So we have a tracked beacon code target. So this target tells me that this is a transponder-equipped aircraft who has an assigned beacon code that we know about, and I can look that beacon code up in the system and see who it belongs to if his data block is not being displayed. And I can also, if his data block's not being displayed, if he's tracked, that means I can display his data block if I choose to. This target here, this group of targets, I'm sorry, I missed one thing that's very important. So you can see there's a target with a symbol on top of it that's kind of attached to the data block via this leader line. And there are some more targets behind that target, in this case 3. So what you're seeing is the present location of the target, which is usually depicted, and it's difficult to see on the screen, but on the radar, you make the brightest object on the scope should be the present location of the targets that you're looking at. Behind it, you can see histories of where the last presentation of the target was, the last sweep of the radar. And these update every 12 seconds for en route antennas, so it takes 12 seconds to happen between targets hits. We call each presentation of a target, controllers we usually refer to as a hit or a target. We never, ever, ever use the word blip. Ever. So that's a beacon target with a beacon code assigned to it. I know who it is. The computer knows who it is. This target down here, and again, it's tough to tell, but the bottom one is the bright one. And that's important because that tells me that he's traveling southbound, right? The present position is the bottom guy, and these are histories in the back. So I know that in this case, United 175 is headed in this direction, to the southwest, and that this aircraft is headed southbound. These are primary targets, and they're plus signs because there are 2 kinds of well, there are 3, but there's a strong primary target and a weak primary target, or a target of good quality and a target of not so good quality. A target of not so good quality is just a little dot. And we see lots of little dots all over the scope, typically because there's ground clutter, there are aircraft that aren't squawking beacon codes at low altitudes, but a lot of ground clutter, really. In fact, we can see one of the antennas in Pennsylvania sees the traffic on the interstate that's right near it all the time. So you can see trucks traveling down the highway on the interstate that look like this. These are strong primary targets. Okay, then there's a third target that we're going to talk about called a Mode C intruder. It looks like this I bar. It looks like the letter I. And the system will depict a Mode C intruder under certain circumstances. Mostly when there's a target inside your airspace with a beacon code assigned, or I'm sorry, not assigned, that is displaying a beacon code. So that means that the transponder on the aircraft is broadcasting its beacon code. In this case, 3320. And we can see that this aircraft is at 31,000 feet, or in our parlance, the word is flight level 310. There's a difference between altitude and flight level that I don't need to get into because it's just very confusing, but basically it means 31,000 feet. But that's an intruder target. I don't like to see intruder targets because they mean usually that something is wrong. And we're going to get into why in just a minute. Okay. Now the nitty-gritty. That's the actual aircraft that American 11 was flying. That's a picture that was taken, I don't know when, but before, but that's the plane. And that's the aircraft at the South Tower. That's the United 175. A very large aircraft. They hold a tremendous amount of fuel. This is what the flight path of American 11 looked like. After takeoff in Boston, it took off on one of the fours, which means runway 4, left or right, to the northeast and made a right turn, came back around. Somewhere over Massachusetts, he was issued a turn to the right and an altitude of 29,000 feet, which he replied to and executed and was no longer heard from again. This is what United 175's flight path looks like. Also departed Boston. He made a right turn to the south, just over northern Connecticut, entered New York Center's airspace in this vicinity. I'm sorry, yeah, and the controller at Boston Center turned him, he enters New York Center's airspace about here. Controller turned him right for traffic because there was an airplane that he wasn't talking to. It was an American 11. And he put him on course and switched him to New York Center's airspace. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something else. This doesn't show up as nicely as it should. It's very difficult to see. There's a clock up here in local time, 8:20 in the morning. This is American 11, squawking the correct beacon code. And he's an intruder target because he's being controlled by Boston, not New York. So I'm looking at him from New York's radar. So it's okay that his target is an intruder. In Boston, it would have looked like that left-leaning slant. He would have had a data block, and the controllers there knew who he was and where he was. So this is a simulation that I created. So, little backstory, I retired in 2014 from air traffic control, worked in New York City in finance for a year, and then I went back to my facility as a subcontractor to instruct. And that was tremendously rewarding and fun work to do, but it didn't pay very well. So the FAA has a technical center in Atlantic City, a large campus, a couple thousand people there. They do everything that's related to aviation. They do research and study and stuff. And one of the things that they do is they build and test the software that does this, that shows the radar. And so every time I'm sitting at a scope and I'm talking to an airplane, every time you give an aircraft an instruction, you have to do something in the computer. If you change his assigned altitude, you have to enter it in the computer. If you want to hand them off to another controller, you put that in the computer. So now I work as a subcontractor to the FAA and I test this software. So I have access to the software. And I built this simulation of the actual airplanes involved that day, and I threw a bunch of other airplanes in just to show you what air traffic control is going to look like. So at 8:20 in the morning on that day, at 8:19 actually, a flight attendant on board American 11 made a phone call to her operations center, and they contacted the FAA and said that the airplane was hijacked. And that some flight attendants had been stabbed and they couldn't get into the cockpit. At 8:25, Boston Center was aware of the hijacking because there were some transmissions made accidentally on that frequency. I really do miss my mouse.
Is that American 11 trying to call? We have some planes that take off and in UK. We're heading to the airport. And who's trying to call me here? American 11, are you trying to call? Everything is okay. If you try to make any move, present yourself and the airplane. Let's be quiet.
So the controller didn't actually hear what the words were, just as it was very difficult, I'm sure, for you guys to hear what the words were just now. You can listen to these things on Wikipedia. Nobody move. Everything will be okay. We are returning to the airport. If you move, you will endanger yourselves and the aircraft. And then a few minutes later, this.
Nobody move, please. Going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves.
Nobody move, please. We are returning to the airport. Don't make any stupid moves. I might not have gotten the words exactly correct, but that's the gist of it. So, so it's 8:20 in the morning in New York Center. The facility I work in is not aware of any of this stuff. Boston Center becomes aware of it at about 8:25. At 8:38, they notified NORAD of the hijacking. At 8:46, NORAD scrambled some fighters out of Otis Air Force Base in Rhode Island. Not that they could have done anything. There was no protocol for attacking a civilian aircraft in the United States. It was unheard of. I'm sure we have something now. All right, so I'm just showing a picture of Sector 55 here and me doing some work on the PowerPoint there. Okay. This is Sector 42. This is the Kennedy High Sector. There's LaGuardia, there's Kennedy, there's Newark. They're very hard to see, but it doesn't matter. What we want to look at is these little plus signs right here. So, the hijackers on board American 11 knew how to do something important, and that was that they turned off the transponder. So now we don't see a 4-digit beacon code. We don't see a data block attached to the target. And we don't see the aircraft's altitude, which is key. So Boston Center's watching this plus sign, making funky turns. He went up toward Albany, he went a little to the northwest of Albany, turned to the south, then he turned right again, and then he turned left again. Probably when they finally kind of got their bearings and they figured out where New York was. Albany is about 120, 125 miles away from New York City, depending on where you're pointing. Okay, so at around 8:30, 8:40, I actually started to get very busy at the Yardley sector. So there's the East Texas sector, my sector is kind of down here, underneath this portion, the bottom right-hand half, kind of. That's my airspace. But 42 is the guy above me. So he's actually waiting for an American 11, and he was late at this time, so he didn't know where he was. And then the controller at Boston Center called him. The guy, this sector up here in Boston is called Kingston. And the Kingston controller called the East Texas controller, Dave, and he tells him, I want you to look for this target on American 11. So I got 42 over here and my sector over here on the left. And there's our target headed kind of for, this is Kingston, New York on the Hudson River, about halfway between Albany and New York City. And he calls the controller at 42 and he tells him, I want you to watch this primary target. We think it might be American 11. We think he's been hijacked. We don't know what his altitude is. His last assigned altitude, his last known altitude was flight level 290, 29,000 feet. So he calls him and he tells him that. Now, I also wanted to just kind of show you what it is that we actually do for a living. All right, so on the left, we're going to see some traffic happen. And this is just kind of a representation. These are not real airplanes. It's not the real traffic from that day. I don't have access to that data. I would have prior to retiring, but it didn't occur to me to try to do this. So what you're seeing is an airplane out of New York that I just climbed to 22,000 feet who's going to Washington, D.C. And his route of flight is on this white line, this J75 that we pointed out before. In fact, all three of these guys are going to fly down J75. The second two, this is a guy from the high altitude. This guy came from Boston Center. I made him from Manchester, but it doesn't matter. He came from the Northeast at a higher altitude. And the way controllers deal with, when an airplane's landing, we have to know when to start descending him, right? We need to know, okay, at what time does he need to be at such and such an altitude? So, in order to do that, what we have a group of standard operating procedures that tell us. So it's kind of set in stone. And in addition, we have letters of memorandum, or letters of memorandums of understanding between facilities. So for example, if I have a guy who's landing at Baltimore, and I'm working in Boston Center up here, and I want to give a Baltimore arrival to New York Center, I have to put him on a very specific route. He has to be assigned the correct route, and I have to deliver him at the correct altitude. So the memorandum of understanding will have a list of arrival airports and how each of them needs to be treated. So Baltimore arrivals enter New York Center's airspace right over here. And then Sector 42 is required to deliver them to Sector 55 at 28,000 feet or lower. So this guy is at 28. The number on the right, it's hard to see there, I know. The number on the right is 28, the number on the left is 23. That means that I've assigned him, I'm already talking to him, and I've descended him to 23,000 feet. And I have a responsibility to deliver Baltimore arrivals to the next guy, down here at the bottom, at 18,000 feet. So I gotta get this guy down 10,000 feet, but there's a delta underneath him going to DC, climbing to 22. So I have to get the US Air under the delta. And then he's going to cross paths with this FedEx off at Kennedy. FedEx is level at 17,000 feet because he's just entering my airspace. I can't climb him yet. He's got to be 2.5 miles from the boundary before I can climb him. And the reason is because I got to have 5 miles between airplanes. If they're at the same altitude, I need 5 miles. And you're going to see what that looks like because I'm going to put a ring on one of the airplanes with a 5-mile radius. So, in addition, this guy's going to Baltimore, well, this guy's going to Baltimore, and so is this guy. So one of the rules is I can't deliver 3 Baltimore arrivals to the next sector stacked up. I got to put them in trail, one behind the other. And I need at least 5 miles behind them. And sometimes they have programs, and traffic management will come down and tell us, you need to deliver the Baltimore's 15 miles in trail. And that increases my workload tremendously. But this is kind of what it looks like. I wish I could have made it bigger, but I couldn't. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit. Okay, there's the ring. So now one of the tools that we use is I can take a location on the map and I can ask the data block to display the target's distance from that location. So these 3 guys going to Baltimore, it's very difficult to see, but there's a little green number here, and here, and here. And that tells me how far each of the Baltimore arrivals is from this place called Copes. So now, when you're doing an in-trail operation, one of the things that you need to do is make sure that the front guy, or the guy you've decided is going to be the front guy, and again, that's where controlling comes into play, right? If you have 2 airplanes that are tied, you have to use the tools available to you and your experience and your training to decide who's going to be first. Well, if I have an aircraft that's typically faster than the other aircraft, everything else being equal, he's going first. No question, right? So heavy jets tend to be faster. 747s, DC-10s, MD-11s, anything wide body, 767s, they're capable of traveling at much faster speeds than 737s or MD-80s or Airbus 320s. So we got 2 US Airs and a Learjet off of Teterboro. All 3 of them are going to Baltimore. Now normally I would only climb the Baltimore departure, the guy who's departed New York but is landing in Baltimore, I'd only climb him to 18,000 feet. However, I got another Baltimore right here who's at 18,000 feet, and I know that I have to vector these guys to get them in trail. So I don't want them at the same altitude. That's very risky. And my job is to minimize or remove risk. So anytime I have a problem like this, I want to use tools that make the risks, that decrease the risks. So having these guys at separate altitudes means that I can vector them all day long and not worry about how close they get to one another. So, but remember, the first problem is we have US Air 381 here who's descending to 23,000 feet, but I got to get him to 18 because I want to get him underneath that delta. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the delta to the right. I could have turned them to the left, but the FedEx is out here, 21.6 climbing to 28, and my delta of here is at 22. So that's not a really smart idea, taking this delta to the left, because I got another airplane out there. So one of the keys to air traffic control is very simple. If you have airplanes in conflict and you need to move one of them, put them in a place where there aren't any other airplanes. It sounds simple, and the principle is, it is not difficult to do. I mean, it's not easy to do in practice. I'm sorry this isn't really as visible as it could be. Okay, so now you can see that I've separated US Air 381 from Delta 1425 because the Delta's on the edge of the hoop. This is a 5-mile hoop. It has a lot of names. Deflector shield is one of them. You use a command that uses the key J on the keyboard, so people call it a J-ball. It's a J-ball, it's a shield. Its official name is DRI, a distance reference indicator, because it indicates to me exactly how far apart these airplanes are. I need 5. So once he's outside of that circle, I can descend US Air 381 to a safe altitude. Now, I might want to go to 19 because I have US Air 535 at 18 here, but back to the in-trail operation. When you've decided who the first airplane is going to be, you want to make that the first airplane as first as possible. I used to tell my trainees to make the first guy firster. And the way you do that is by speeding him up. So you assign an aircraft a speed that you think he can do. If you really need something from him, you kind of try to negotiate with him to get as much as you can, especially if you're busy. So in this case, I've just assigned him 310 knots or greater. That's indicated airspeed. His actual ground speed, as you can see, or not see so much, is 446 knots. Not miles an hour, knots. So there's about 6 miles an hour is about 7 knots. 7 knots. 6 knots. 6 knots is about 7 miles an hour, yeah. So it's a little faster than miles an hour. So we assign him a faster speed. Now, I want to slow both of these guys down, but I don't want to slow the middle guy down too much, because then he becomes a problem for the third guy. So you kind of have to be judicious when you're assigning the speed to the middle guy. Now, if you have 7 or 8 aircraft that you have to put in trail, it gets very difficult. And there are strategies for dealing with that. But in this case, so we go 310 here, 300 knots on US Air 535, and we also have assigned US Air 535 a heading of 290, which should put him to the northwest and tuck him in behind the front US Air. And then 404 Charlie Tango, which is a call sign I use because that was the call sign of the aircraft that I used to own a long time ago. We've slowed him to 250 knots, which is the slowest speed that I'm permitted to assign an aircraft, a turbojet aircraft in flight level airspace. So we have the delta off to the right at 22, and we're just going to run him down here to parallel this airway, and then we're going to give him a shortcut, because his route of flight actually starts up. His route of flight comes down here and then goes to the west. So I'm going to give him a shortcut down here when I put him back on course. FedEx 377 is no longer a problem for anybody because he's at 24,300 climbing 28, which means he's above all 3 of these guys. I'm done with him. I can give him to the next controller. And you're going to see, if it's visible, you can see that the data block is blinking down here, and then it stopped blinking. So what I did was I initiated a handoff to the next sector, sector 9. 9 accepts the handoff, which I can see on the scope. I get a little R in front of the data block that tells me that guy's no longer mine. And when I'm done with them, I say, FedEx 377, contact New York Center 134.32, good day. And he says, he reads back the frequency, and he says goodbye. So now I only have these 4 airplanes. US Air 381 is speeding up to 310. I initiate a handoff to the next sector on him, showing the speed assignment in the data block. So the next controller can see that he's assigned a speed. If he doesn't like that speed, he has to call me and tell me I need something else. Slow him to 280. Well, if he tells me to slow that guy to 280, I got to slow both of these guys to 280. And I got to vector him a little bit more. So, this is about where we were. I'm going to pause it just for a second because, so I was a little bit, in the real world on that day, I was actually much busier than this. This might seem a little complicated to you, and it is a little bit complicated, but I probably had 5 or 6 more airplanes in the airspace than you're seeing right now. I was really busy, which is kind of stressful. I was talking to somebody, a gentleman over here earlier. One of the things that people say to you when you inform them that you're an air traffic controller typically is, oh, that's a stressful job, isn't it? And yeah, it has its moments, there's no question. But typically, a day, you can work an entire day, and it's just routine. You climb guys to the same altitude, you descend them to the same altitude, you assign the same airspeeds. A little vectoring operation like this is, par for the course. Some days it gets extraordinarily busy. When it gets complicated, it can get very complicated and very nasty. And you kind of got to keep your wits about you. One of the cool things about air traffic control is that you don't have to be a genius to do it. And there are different levels of competence in every field, and the same is true in ours. Not everybody is a perfect expert, myself included, no question. There's a joke that an engineer friend of mine told me. He says, what do you call the guy who graduates at the very bottom of his class in medical school? Doctor. It's the same in my field. We have some knuckleheads. We have some really gifted people. I had a couple of mentors that were just tremendously intelligent people that understood everything about this. And the way for a controller to stay on top of his game is to be curious, to be creative. It doesn't sound like you need to be creative. You gotta be creative sometimes though when you want to solve problems. I had a situation at the Kennedy High sector. Well, I'll just tell you this story because it's kind of cool. Back then, if you were below 29,000 feet, if you're separated vertically by 1,000 feet, then I can let the targets merge. It doesn't matter what they do. If they're less than 1,000 feet vertical, I need 5 miles. Above 29,000 feet, back then, not now, but back then, you needed 2,000 feet because altimeters weren't as precise as they are now. So we didn't assign even altitudes above 29,000 feet. The next available altitude above 29 was 31. 31, 33, 35, 37. So 31 and 35 and 39 were south and westbound altitudes, and 31 and 33, 33 and 37 and 41 were east and northbound altitudes. So we didn't have as many altitudes available to us. So the airspace is now kind of easier to work because we can use every cardinal altitude that we choose to. So in this situation, I was working the Kennedy High sector, which is, of course, centered kind of over the Kennedy Airport. But again, in New York Center, we typically, if you're working the airspace over a city, the stuff that you're doing has nothing to do with that city, right? So if you're working the Kennedy High sector, you're working arrivals that are going into Boston, Bradley, Connecticut, Manchester, New Hampshire, overseas, lots of traffic going overseas. So stuff coming out of Washington, D.C., or Baltimore, or Dulles Airport, flies over New York and heads off to the Atlantic Ocean. So I was working a bunch of airplanes, 5 of whom were at the same altitude and all pointed at Kennedy from different directions. And I didn't have a clue what to do at first. And Audrey was telling me yesterday that one of her least favorite things when she's driving a car is encountering a traffic circle or a rotary. That's a really handy tool in air traffic control, actually. So all 5 of these guys were pointed at Kennedy, and I just turned them all 40 degrees to the right. When they got to about 20 miles from Kennedy, everybody went to the right. They went around the circle, and when they cleared each other, I put them on course, and it worked perfectly. And I got a pat on the back, which never happens, by the way, in my field. You get criticized, and that's it. It's extremely rare to have somebody say, "Wow, that was really good, Tom." So that's just kind of an example of some of the stuff we encounter. So in this case, we have US Air 381 at 310 or greater, descending to 18. US Air 535 is about 7 miles behind him at 18, still assigned a slower speed. And 4 Charlie Tango has gone hard left, and now he's going back to the right again. And he's still assigned a much slower speed, 250 indicated. So what I'm going to do is when I'm finished with them and I get them all on course, I'm going to assign the middle guy 310, and Charlie Tango is going to get 310 or less. FedEx is gone. Delta gets a shortcut. I put it in the data block. It says Vinny there. That's the name of the fix that he's going to go direct to. So I told Delta 1425, clear direct to the Vinny intersection, resume your own navigation. And he's happy about that because he got a shortcut. Pilots love shortcuts. So, I'm going to pause it again because we're going to look over here. About this time, and this is kind of the way it happened that day. I missed something kind of important at the very beginning of the story, but we'll get to that in a second. At about this time, when I'm just finishing up, I still have a few guys on the frequency, but I'm done solving the problems, right? I've resolved the situations, everything's done. Boston Center calls the East Texas sector. The Kingston Center in Boston calls the East Texas sector in New York and tells them, watch this primary target over here. We think it was a hijack 767. We think it's American 11. Tells them his last assigned altitude was 29,000 feet. But we don't know what his altitude is now because he doesn't have a transponder broadcasting his altitude to us. We call that mode C. We don't see any mode C altitude here. So because I'm not busy anymore, I had a higher altitude aircraft and I wanted to climb him above 28,000 feet because the ceiling of my airspace is 28,000 feet back here. Well, the whole thing. And so what you do when you want to climb a guy to a higher altitude, you can do two things when you want to enter another sector's airspace. You can hand the airplane off to that sector. He takes the handoff. You put him on his frequency. He works the airplane, climbs him, does whatever he has to do with him. Or, if the airplane's only going to be in his airspace for a short amount of time, you do what's called a point out. And you call the controller and you say, punch up this computer number, and you can see that the bottom left-hand number is the number in the data block that we call the CID, the computer identification number. He punches that number, he hits the enter key, and the data block pops up on his scope. And I'll say, for example, Delta 1425, I'd like to climb him to flight level 310, southwestbound on J75. And he'll say point out approved, or he'll say traffic. And he'll show me some other data blocks that I have to bring up on my scope. He says, miss those two guys and point out's approved. So in reality on that day, I had a guy who was climbing very fast. He was back here, he's about the level of 28,000 feet. I don't want him to level at 28. He wants to go to 36,000 feet. I want to get him to his cruising altitude as soon as possible. So I had an assistant sitting next to me, an H controller, and I asked her to call 42 and get higher on this airplane. So she calls 42, and the guy sitting at 42 that day had a kind of a penchant for the dramatic. And it was very difficult to take him seriously, frequently. So she calls 42. I'm working the airplanes, putting people on different frequencies and finishing up the vectors. She hangs up and she says, Dave says he's got a hijack. And I said, get a real controller over there. Honestly. And you can actually hear that on one of the tapes. You can hear me in the background. If you're listening to Dave's tapes, you can hear me say that. But it's just, we're normal people doing normal stuff. We mess with one another. It's, we were just working. And he was not a person who could frequently be taken seriously, so we didn't, But it was true. American 11 had been hijacked. And by this time, the chief of the facility has walked into our area and is standing behind Dave at Sector 42. He's got a cell phone and then his assistant, the deputy chief, comes in. And they're both standing behind 42. And I'm like, what the? And I hear the conversation about American 11, and there's a primary target. And Dave's busy, he's got other airplanes, and I figure somebody could help us here. So I call NORAD. Every controller in our facility has a button that they can push, and they're in contact with, well, in those days, the sector that we talked to was NEADS, the Northeast Air Defense Sector, based in Rome, New York, at what used to be Griffiths Air Force Base. But NEADS is still there, but Griffiths is not. So I called Huntress, and their call sign is, I called NEADS, and their call sign is Huntress. So when I call them on the phone, I say, Huntress, New York Center on the 15 line. Or you have to specify who you want to talk to in Huntress. Huntress ID was who we normally talk to because they're responsible for identifying every single aircraft that enters the continental United States airspace from over the Atlantic Ocean or from the Canadian border. So Huntress ID was who you called when you had an aircraft that was about to enter New York or enter the continental United States airspace. So I didn't know that I could contact Huntress battle stations, for example. I only knew about Huntress ID. So I called them, and the person that answered the phone sounded to me at the time like they were maybe 15 years old. It was definitely a very young person, there's no question. And I said, I'm looking at a target about 15 miles north of LaGuardia, a primary target southbound. Do you see this guy? We think he's a hijack. What? Where? I said, there's a primary target 15 miles north of LaGuardia, tracking southbound over the Hudson River. We think it's a hijacked American Airlines 767. I don't see him. I said, he's about 15 miles north of LaGuardia on the Hudson River. It's a very easy location to figure out. But I don't look at the same scopes that they do. I don't know what they're looking at. She says, I'm looking at thousands of airplanes. I can't see him. And I kind of gave up and I hung up the phone. It didn't matter because the Huntress was already deeply involved. I just didn't know. So now that New York Center is aware of American 11's situation, every eye in the house is looking at this target. I mean, staring like lasers at the radar scope at this target. So American starts tracking southbound. One of the things that I meant to mention at the very beginning was that that morning, when I arrived for work for a 7 to 3 shift at New York Center, I got out of my car and I walked up the staircase to the entrance by the loading dock that I used to get in the building, and I stopped and did something that I never do. I stood there and just stared at the sky because it was a really incredibly blue sky. It was rare. The sky was like crystalline almost. It was bizarre. It was so beautiful that I stopped there and I just gawked at it because it was so beautiful. And that's kind of a reason that this happened on that day, because they couldn't have picked a better day. Pilots call it CAVU. C-A-V-U, ceilings and visibility unlimited. You could see, on a day like that, if you were in an air traffic control tower out on Long Island, you could see the skyline of Manhattan as plain as day, from 60 miles away. So, this target begins to head south. Here's LaGuardia. Here's Newark. And I wrote WTC here on the scope and I plunked it down at a location on the scope. This is actually not the location of the actual towers. This is the location of the Wall Street downtown heliport on the southeast corner of Manhattan. And it's about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the actual location of where the World Trade Center was. But it's close enough for depicting it on the radar scope because just to give you an example, these little targets that you can hardly see are about a mile wide. So the target is going, now he's pointed at New York City. We don't know his altitude. We have no idea what he's doing. There he is right there. Every 12 seconds, we get a new target. This is a simulation thing here. This airplane never really shows up in the real world that close to this target. This is just an artifact of the way the simulation shows the airplanes departing. He's a couple of miles from downtown Manhattan. is over northern Manhattan, this is like Harlem now. The controller at Kennedy High has actually vectored an airplane to intercept at a higher altitude to look for that target. He doesn't see it. Says there's nobody there. We keep getting targets. And we were waiting, just like you are right now. And the target disappeared. And in other locations, maybe they had a better idea what was going on, but in my area, in New York Center, all we knew was that we no longer had a target displayed. That's it. It didn't occur to any one of us, I don't think. Maybe others, it didn't come up in conversation, but it didn't occur to me for sure that aircraft had just crashed into the World Trade Center. It wasn't a possibility that even entered my mind. I mean, the last hijack we had seen was in the early 90s, and it was, in the early 80s. The last actual hijacking we'd seen was a FedEx disgruntled employee pilot who sat in the jump seat of a FedEx aircraft and I want to say he was departing Memphis, I can't remember. And he pulled the fire axe out of the back seat of the co-pilot's chair and attacked the pilots. And happily they subdued him, and he failed in his murder-suicide attempt. But that was the last hijack that we had seen. And it never occurred to us that somebody would hijack an aircraft and crash it into a building. So we didn't know that American 11 had crashed. We knew he'd been hijacked, but he just disappeared. So now we're kind of going back to work. And now I'm going to back up. Because 20 seconds after, well, we'll back up a little bit before that, actually. Okay. So American 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 and 40 seconds. Give or take a second or two. This clock says 8:45 and 46 seconds. And a little artifact of the simulation. In the real world, this would be Zulu time. I wouldn't be looking at local time on the clock. So the real time on this clock would say 12:45, because we're -4 Zulu, which is Greenwich Mean Time. Everything in air traffic control is Zulu time all the time. That way there's no confusion ever about the time. So after we found out about American 11, Boston Center handed off an airplane to the East Texas sector. Again, I went the wrong way, sorry. He hands off an aircraft to the East Texas sector called United 175 at flight level 310, which is another 767 out of Boston, also headed for Los Angeles, just like American 11. And when this guy shows up on Dave's frequency, he says, listen, we heard a suspicious transmission on the last frequency, and we didn't want to bring it up there, so we waited until we got to talk to you. But it sounded like we heard somebody say, everybody stay in your seats. And he tells that to Dave, and Dave calls the controller at Kingston and tells him. And I wasn't privy to that conversation. I could hear Dave's side of the conversation, but not Boston Center's. But I'm sure they just acknowledged it. And so Dave hangs up the phone, and you can see here's American 11 again, southbound, headed for New York City, doing what we don't know, because we're all staring at American 11's target. Very intensely. Much to the detriment, actually, to the rest of the workers. I'm responsible for this chunk of airspace. My eyes are supposed to be here all the time. And I'm staring intensely at this radar target. So Dave doesn't notice A few seconds later, after the American 11's target disappears off the scope, that United 175 changes its beacon code. And it shows up on the screen now. I can see the code to the right of the data block, which I wouldn't see if he was on the correct code. It wouldn't show me the code. And the data block and the position indicator that's attached to the target separates from the target. So his target, instead of being a left-leaning slant, switches to a right-leaning slant, and then it switches to an I, an intruder target. And that becomes important because a couple of minutes later, so Dave doesn't see this yet, because we're all, what the hell happened to American 11? And then a couple of minutes pass, and now we see this intruder target out here at 31,000 feet, who is no longer connected to his data block. And we're not even sure now that it's United 175 because nobody saw the target separate from the data block and peel away on the new beacon code. And they changed the beacon code twice in quick succession. And I had a couple of airplanes on the frequency. I had a string of Kennedy departures. I'm only showing two of them here. And I had these two guys, a guy at level at 28,000 feet that Dave just gave to me from Sector 42, and another guy underneath them, and they're both going to Charlotte, and I have to deliver Charlotte arrivals to the next controller 15 miles in trail. I have a little note on the scope that tells me I need 15 between these two guys. And somewhere in here, US Air 542 shows up on my frequency, and I climb him to 26, because that's the next safe altitude, separated from Delta 2315. He's southwestbound, so I don't want to give him an odd altitude. An odd altitude is for aircraft that are traveling north and east. So a habit of mine was to not climb to 27, but to climb to 26, which is, yes, it's 2,000 feet away from Delta 2315, but it's just, if you're using good working habits, it's a safer altitude in general because he's southwestbound. It's a correct altitude for direction of flight. So I climb the US Air to 542. He's climbing pretty fast. And I hear a voice behind me from another controller say, hey, there's a, oops, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to turn that on. Well, that's a good time for that. A voice behind me says, hey, there's an intruder over Allentown. So we're looking, and Dave sees that the data block for United 175 is no longer connected to its target. And he starts calling. United 175, how do you read New York? United 175, New York? Nothing. So this target climbs, then it turns to the south and it starts descending. Well, I got a guy in here at 28 who's southwestbound, and I got a guy climbing at 26 also southwestbound. I don't think he's a factor for this guy down here because he's already behind him. But what the hell's going on? So he gets a little closer and he starts turning to the east. And now I'm very concerned. So now they're about 15 miles apart, and I say to this Delta, I say, Delta 2315, you have traffic at 1 o'clock, 15 miles southwestbound at the moment. We think it's a hijacked 767. I wanted to say no, but I didn't. And then I call the traffic to the US Air also. US Air 542, you have traffic 1 o'clock, 12 miles southeastbound, descending out at 31,000 feet. We don't know his intentions. We think it's a hijack 76. The computer is now telling me that it doesn't like the fact that these two airplanes are in this proximity at these altitudes, because this guy's descending at a very high speed, and now he's turning toward the Delta. Now, I'm going to stop this for just a second, because I beat myself up for years after this incident, because these airplanes are going to get very close to one another, which is like antithesis to, it's anathema to everything that air traffic controllers do. We keep airplanes apart. We don't let them get together, ever. And these guys got nasty, scary close. And I beat myself up about it for a long time, until I went back and I looked at the data, and the hijackers stopped turning. My initial, because I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do. And I'm thinking that I'm going to probably end up going to the left with my guys, because this guy's turning night, and it looked like the radius of the turn was going to bring him up to the northeast up here. But right about here, he stopped turning to the northeast, and he went southeastbound some more. And I didn't see that or perceive it that day that he had stopped turning. So now it's Delta 2315, traffic's 1 o'clock and 8 miles, turning opposite direction, descending at 30,000 feet. I want you to do whatever you have to do to miss that aircraft, take evasive action, whatever, I don't care. And then I say words to the same effect to the US Air. Now I don't like it at all. Delta 2315, turn left immediately, heading 200. US Air 542, turn left immediately, heading 200. Air traffic controllers do not use the word immediately, like ever, because people can get hurt in the airplane if I say that word. If I say descend immediately, the pilot could slam me right up to the control, right up to the instrument panel. So it's a word that requires a very, very aggressive response. And Delta 2315 reads back to me, okay, left to heading 200. You got it. Really? US Air reads it back just fine. Left to heading 200, thanks, US Air 542. 28,200 feet and 28,000 feet. He passes him by about 2 miles. It's actually about 2 miles apart. He starts descending again rapidly. New York, US Air 542, we're in a TCAS descent. You can see he's at 26. Now he's at 25.6. The target passes over him at 27,000 feet. US Air 542, sorry about that, sir. I really thought he was going to hit the Delta. Those are my exact words. It turns out that, so the simulation's a little bit inaccurate. They look really, really close on the screen here, right? And I gotta tell you, prior to the targets getting close to one another, I stood up, backed away from the scope, and started screaming obscenities at it. Because I was done, I couldn't do anything else. I had already made my move. And I had to wait 24 seconds to see the turns take place. They're like battleships, airplanes in the sky. They take miles to turn. But the turns worked. But they were much too close for comfort. At the moment, for me, it looked like I couldn't fit a sheet of paper between those two airplanes, the first two. He actually missed them laterally by about 2 miles, both of them. So the turns worked. But much too late and much too close for my comfort. I was very, very upset. And really, really upset with myself. So just a little backstory. US Air 542 says he's in a TCAS descent. What the hell does that mean? So there's a device on a commercial aircraft, any aircraft that has more than 19 seats, I think, that flies IFR, has to have this device. It's called a terminal collision avoidance system. And this device is on the instrument panel of the aircraft, and if it detects a threat from another Mode C aircraft that's broadcasting its altitude, it can institute a resolution to what it thinks is the threat. And it uses all kinds of fantastic algorithms to decide what to do. Backed away from the scope and started screaming obscenities at it. Because I was done, I couldn't do anything else. I had already made my move. And I had to wait 24 seconds to see the turns take place. They're like battleships, airplanes in the sky. They take miles to turn. But the turns worked. But they were much too close for comfort. At the moment, for me, it looked like I couldn't fit a sheet of paper between those two airplanes, the first two. He actually missed them laterally by about 2 miles, both of them. So the turns worked. So just a little backstory. US Air 542 says he's in the TCAS descent. What the hell does that mean? So there's a device on commercial aircraft, any aircraft that has more than 19 seats, I think, that flies IFR, has to have this device. It's called a terminal collision avoidance system. And this device is on the instrument panel of the aircraft, and if it detects a threat from another Mode C aircraft that's broadcasting its altitude, it can institute a resolution to what it thinks is the threat. And it uses all kinds of fantastic algorithms to decide what to do. And then there's a TCAS typically on both aircraft, and the TCAS devices talk to one another. And the one with the higher serial number becomes the master, and the one with the lower serial number becomes the slave. And the TCAS comes up with a solution, and it enforces that, or it executes that solution by instructing the pilots verbally to do something. So in this case, US Air 542's TCAS actually says to him, descend, descend now, descend, descend now. He is obligated to follow that instruction. TCAS is a fantastic, wonderful device. When they first instituted it, it was horrible because they didn't institute it correctly, and it actually led to near mid-air collisions instead of solving them. But once they got it dialed in, it's a fantastic thing, and it's there to solve situations that are caused by controllers that screw up. Mistakes happen. Typically, we have there are enough protections involved, in the design of the system that keep airplanes apart. But controllers make mistakes. We're people. So TCAS some controllers hate it. I think it's a fantastic thing. I have seen it save lives. There's no question that it works. It's fantastic. But anyway, that's what was happening with US Air 542. That's why he descended. Airplanes don't descend. They don't change their altitude. They don't change their heading. They don't do anything in the instrument rules environment without instructions or permission from an air traffic controller. Ever. Unless they have an emergency. And then in that case, they're required to inform us what they're going to do. So in this case, US Air 542 informed me. We're in the TCAS descent. Okay. So I've just had a very, very bad day. I don't know that anybody's perished. I don't know about American 11. We don't have any idea yet in New York Center that people have died. But we're watching this target that we believe is United 175. And he starts descending rapidly. Excuse me, and he's heading toward the city, and he's very difficult to see, but he's right there. 20,000 feet, 17,000 feet. I hear another controller from the New York TRACON on the radio. Who's this guy blasting through my airspace doing 700 knots over the ground? It was my assistant. hadn't called him. And we watched. And again, there's some problems with the way the simulator works here. In the real world, there's a fudge with it to make it show what the target, in this case, actually did. Because they were going really, really fast. So one of the things that we knew that the guys that were operating this aircraft were not pilots. Because they didn't do the things that pilots would do if, for example, there was an emergency. They would have told us something. And another thing that happened is one of the reasons that the turn was so large is because they didn't slow the airplane down. The first thing that pilots do when they begin to descend is they grab the throttle handles and they just pull them all the way back to idle, and the aircraft will begin descending. Because if you descend an aircraft that has its throttle set in a cruise position, you're going to make it go really, really fast, and you could do structural damage to the aircraft. And so these guys, I don't think were aware of that, and there were probably alarm clackers going off inside that flight deck. So they were traveling at a very, very high ground speed, which would not have been the case had there been pilots in control of the aircraft. And that made the turn really big back here, which was one of the reasons that they got so close. And also, they stopped turning. So we're watching this target descending rapidly, pointed right at New York, and we're speculating now, well, maybe he's an emergency. Maybe he's, initially we thought maybe he's going to Newark, because Newark has big runways. If you're in an aircraft that's in trouble, you want a big runway, typically. Kennedy would have been the best choice if it was close enough, but Newark, well, he's not going to Newark. Maybe he's pointed right at LaGuardia. Maybe he's trying to get to runway 4 at LaGuardia. And a guy behind me who was, in a former life, was a commercial pilot and became an air traffic controller because he had a very, very nasty near-midair collision himself. He was flying a Beach Baron into Kennedy in solid IFR weather, and he saw that right in front of him. That was the last day he flew. Controller screwed up, no question. But he was an authority when it came to, and he actually was the guy who taught me how to become an air traffic controller. He was an authority on, what pilots are thinking and doing. And we're thinking, now, maybe he's an emergency. Maybe he's trying for the 4s at Newark. Maybe he's trying to get to LaGuardia. And Jimmy's back there shaking his head. He goes, no, this guy's going in. 3 more hits. 2 more hits. And I can't make it happen in the simulator, but he disappeared. And this guy, we knew, had just crashed. And we knew he had crashed in Lower Manhattan and killed everybody on that airplane, and God knows how many people on the ground. So a few minutes later, the supervisor comes back into the area and he starts asking controllers, does anybody need to get up? He points at me, Tuck, you want to get up? Yeah, I'd like to get up, please. Everybody saw this happen on national television. We didn't know that yet, but I drive into work, and it turns out that the FAA and the National Air Traffic Controllers Association, but the key is that they're controllers. They're when I'm talking about, they know exactly what I mean when I'm talking about an airplane and its behavior or something like that. And they do the same thing for law enforcement and for firemen. You guys might have CISM teams in the fire department. I saw some of you gentlemen back there. So I sit down in this room. There's 2 controllers. There's a mental health professional, either a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a counselor of some sort, I don't recall, and a priest. And we start talking, and the lead team member says to me, he says, Chris, so Normally we have a group of you here, but you're the only one that showed up. Just nobody else. It's New York, you know. New Yorkers. What can I say? He says, but you know, I feel like we're kind of ganging up on you. And normally we would have this very structured conversation, and I don't think we should do that. I think we're just going to talk because we don't want to gang up on you. So we talked about what happened, and he asked me some questions about how the incidents of that day were affecting my life. And we talked about that. And the more we talked, the whole group is talking now. We talk and talk and talk. And I'm in there for like an hour and a half. And he says, Chris, you know, we're trained in this, and we've been doing this a long time. And I have to tell you that sitting here right now, you are making us feel better about this than we are making you feel better. I think you should be on this team. And the next day they invited me to join that team. I joined that team and I was a national coordinator on that team for the next 14 years of my career, which was extraordinarily rewarding and fulfilling and fantastic work because you knew you were helping people. There's no question about it. It was really cool. Very tragic, sometimes very painful, because you're dealing with, you know, if you're talking to a controller who just watched his friend die in an airplane on the runway in front of him, that's rough stuff. But we were able to, the whole point of the team was to get controllers who had no interest whatsoever in talking to a shrink access to some sort of mental health professional to get them real help, because they don't know that they need help yet. So that was very rewarding. And yes, Audrey, I am going to talk about the judge. So, after 9/11, a couple of weeks later, I get a phone call from a fellow controller who has a friend who is a newspaper reporter for a newspaper in Connecticut called the Hartford Courant. And he says, Chris, would you mind talking to this guy? I think he's interested in, you know, in the story you have to tell. I said, oh, sure, I'll talk to him. Give him my phone number. So the gentleman calls me, and he's a really, really sharp, very nice, very interested guy, intelligent, very sharp questions. And we had a really good conversation. It was really nice. I enjoyed talking to him. And he prints up a very nice article and actually sends me a copy. But I get another phone call from him like 3 days later. He says, Chris, it's me again. I said, hi. He says, I have a very odd request for you. I said, what's that? He says, a reader contacted the newspaper and asked me if I would give him your phone number. I said, why is that? He said, because he was on board Delta 2315 out of Bradley going to Charlotte. And he wanted to thank you personally for saving his life. I was so touched, I didn't know what to say. So I said, yeah, let him give him my number, let him call me. So the gentleman called me. He's a circuit court judge in Connecticut, much older than I was at the time. And he talked to me for 2.5 hours on the phone. We had a wonderful conversation, and he thanked me from the bottom of his heart for doing what I did for a living for 25 years, every single day. And I think that kind of saved me, you know. Not that I was in terrible danger of anything. I'm not the kind of person who's capable of harming myself or drinking myself into a stupor, or into stupidity or death or something horrible like that. But it was a really, just a genuine, heartfelt thing that made a tremendous difference to me in my life on that day. And I'm sure I missed some stuff, but I think that's about all I got. Does anybody have or any questions about anything? About that day? About air traffic control? About how that works? Can you turn the house lights up just a little bit so I can see the folks? I'm not patronizing at all. But pilots are our babies, and we take care of them. Whether they think we're doing that or not. You know? They don't always agree with what we want to do. And that happens because pilots and controllers have we have different set of priorities. Pilots' priorities are aviate, communicate, and navigate in that order. Fly the airplane first, then figure out where you are, then tell air traffic control what's going on if you can. Our priorities are safe, orderly, expeditious, in that order. So pilots want to go first, they want shortcuts. That's expeditious. That's the last thing on my list. So you get arguments between pilots and controllers sometimes. So when you lose an airplane, for a controller, it's just somehow a little bit more devastating than you're prepared for. And I started kind of coming apart at the seams while I was sitting there and trying to keep it together. And I'm still talking to airplanes and my voice is shaking. The girl next to me is crying. The guy next to me is crying because his best friend worked in Windows on the World, the restaurant on the top of the World Trade Center. And he knew right then and there that his friend was dead, his best friend. He was a wreck. And he's still talking airplanes. So he and I got up, and I had quit smoking like 10 years prior. And I walked out of the area and I walked up past the watch desk, and the TMU supervisor in charge of the control floor at that time was on a phone. He had a phone in his hand, and the phone was red, and he's screaming into the phone, "I don't care what you do with them, just get them in the air." And I'm thinking, oh, fighters. He's trying to get some fighters in the air. And back then, computers, if you remember, the screens for computers were really big and fat, right? So there's a bunch of computer screens between he and I. And while he's on the phone screaming at this guy, I reach over to computers and I grab the cigarettes out of his pocket. and I walk outside and I smoke the entire pack of cigarettes. I didn't feel so good after that. So yeah, it was a horrible day. 2,753 people perished in New York City that day. For my part, luckily I didn't know a single one of them, except maybe the pilots that I had talked to probably 100 times each before, without ever knowing their names. That's the nature of the work that we do. And so I take some time off from work, and that day they sequester us. We go upstairs, they have this big reel-to-reel tape recorder, big fat microphone just like this one. Sit us all at a table, and they pass the microphone around and ask us to describe what just happened. And we're like, you got the tapes, you got the radar data, you have the voice tapes. What do you need us to tell you for? So, but they pass the tape around. And so we all do this little interview thing, and then they realize that they don't have the machine on record. So then we do it again. And then our stories kind of changed a little bit. Oh, I remembered something, you know. So whatever we said on that tape that day, and the quality assurance man in charge of all of that stuff that day took that tape and listened to it the next day, and listened to it again, and then he burned it. because there was no useful data on the tape. It was all emotions. And it was a huge scandal. I don't know if you're familiar or recall, but the New York Times went bonkers because the FAA destroyed a tape. There was a tape recording made, and there was a conspiracy theories behind all that. And I got to tell you, I was in the room, I was on the tape. There was nothing important on the tape. So, no conspiracy theories. So, I take some time off from work. I didn't feel good, so the very next day I went to see a shrink. Just because I was coming apart, you know. He was a very, very nice, intelligent, and careful practitioner, and he knew his business. And when I walked out of the door of his office, I felt not like $1 million, but I felt like I was going to make it through the day. Maybe not the week, but definitely the rest of the day. I went and I rode a bicycle. The weather was beautiful for the whole week. My wife and I went and sat outside, outdoor dining at restaurants, met some other friends who were controllers who happened to be in the room at the same time. And we talked about it. I didn't watch the television for 2 weeks. Maybe once I watched the airplanes hit the buildings. I was going to show those videos to you, but I don't think it's necessary. It's just too graphic, and I saw some kids in the audience, and I didn't want to show them. If you want to see it, it's on YouTube. But